And there he is! You see him? Right there. That little guy right in the balloon. That's Dottore. Now look, I know we've only got confirmation that Arlecchino is in Fontaine, but I am thoroughly convinced that Dottore is also here. His stupid fingerprints are all over the evidence, Your Honor. In fact, I think a lot of the stuff we've encountered so far in Fontaine has to do with who and what he really is. So let's spend some time going over all the things we've learned, everything we know about Dottore so far, and how it all comes together in this nice and neat little package. And I promise this is going to be a wild, wacky, and head-spinning conclusion at the end, so I hope you're ready for a nice little visit to the doctor's office. But just a heads up, this video does require you to have completed Acts 1 and 2 of the Fontaine Archon Quest, as well as the Perry Quest in the desert, and the Narzissenkruez Institute World Quest. I apologize for my American accent. No, it is not going to get better. I'm doing my best. Now, props if you've also completed the Melazine quest, as I will be referencing a couple of things from that too, but it is nothing that isn't found in the Narzissenkreuz Institute quest as well, so don't worry too much about that. With the disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and dip our toes into the shallow pond that is the established Dottore lore, so we can get to the good stuff. I think that after the events of Sumeru, most people are in agreement that Dottore is actually the exiled scholar known as Zandik. The arguments for this are pretty sound. The name Zandik means heretic, a term commonly conflated with Dottore, from his base named Heresies to the many times he's straight up called blasphemous or a literal heretic. As a scholar, Zandik was enamored with the idea of enhancing humans and also had a fascination with machinery, especially that of the Khvarena variety. If you put those ideas together, you have a wonderful formula that the academia just hates, so ultimately he was eventually exiled to the desert over his research, where he was later recruited into the Fatui by Piero. Now, while the name Zandik is never directly referenced alongside Dottore, some people have tried to rename their wanderer Zandik, and he gives the response that's usually reserved for other named harbingers. That makes it very likely that the name Zandik, at the very least, whether it's Dottore or not, is important to the plot at some point, because otherwise you wouldn't just reference this random scholar that you found papers about in the jungle, you know? So all of this is just to say that Dottore's real name should be Zandik, and that he's a Sumeru native with some crazy ideas about forced human evolution. I mean, Dottore himself even claims Sumeru as his homeland on screen during the Archon Quest, so that's it, right? It's a pretty simple backstory. But hold on a second, because I don't think this is the whole story. It's far too simple for such a high-ranking harbinger, don't you think? So there are three things in particular that stand out to me as being quite odd if Dottore is a Sumeru native, and only a Sumeru native. First, his design is Plague Doctor themed, and as far as my research can tell, Plague Doctors were a bit exclusive to Europe and not really to the Middle East or Northern Africa. Second, every time we've seen an alternate Dottore, he's been very French? So Fontainian. Like back when he was manipulating Scaramouche, he took the identity of Escher, a Fontaine mechanic. That's a little bit weird, since he could have just as easily done the job with an academia identity. And in the manga, young Dottore dresses in European clothing. His Fatui uniform also does seem to have a couple of symbols from the academia on it, but on the whole, he still looks very European. And I am not the only one who seems to think this. I found this analysis from a Chinese player who pointed out that Dottore appears to reference Julien Offray de la Mettrie, a French physician and the author of Man, a Machine, who was also exiled for his work being considered a bit too heretical, only to receive an offer by a Prussian king later on. Now, Prussia being Germany before Germany was Germany, so this would be a reference to Piero based on the assumption that Khvarena is at least in part Germanic, but that is a topic for another video entirely. Now, coincidentally, Zandik also called the human body a type of machine. This will become a running theme, so remember it for later. Now, I did say there were three things that bothered me, and I have only listed two. But listen, there are a lot of French and Fontaine references here, which makes a third thing that falls into the French Fontaine basket all the more suspicious. See, one of Dottore's influences is the Phantom of the Opera. And the trials of Fontaine are held in an opera house. The original mask worn by the Phantom, whose real name is Eric, covered half of the face vertically to hide his disfigured features. This matches the type of mask that Dottore of the manga wore. You can easily argue that the manga version of Dottore was just redesigned for the game, but I'd argue that the Dottore in the manga is supposed to be a younger version of Dottore proper. A segment made from one of his younger perspectives. While the in-game model for Dottore doesn't really resemble the Phantom anymore, however, he did retain some elements in common with him. For example, while little is known about the Phantom's past, what we do know is that he traveled notably to Persia, France, and Russia. So that would be Sumeru, Fontaine, and Snezhnaya. An unnamed Persian character from the book apparently saved the Phantom's life in Persia as well, and that seems coincidental given that Khvarena is located beneath Sumeru, and that happens to be where Piero is from. Also, in Travail, Fontaine bears the title Masquerade of the Guilty, and lo and behold, Phantom of the Opera has a masquerade theme, and one of the major plot points of the book involves a chandelier falling and killing somebody on stage. It's a bit like how the water tank fell and killed Cowl on stage during the 4.0 Archon Quest. Now I know Dottore wasn't present, so this argument doesn't really hold very much water on the surface, but this is where two other unique details from the Phantom of the Opera start to come back into play. When Linny goes to investigate the oratrice during the performance, he hears a voice that calls out to him, referencing him by name, and that spooks him. And during one of the scenes in The Phantom of the opera calls out to the female lead Christine through a mirror, which he then uses to lure her deep beneath the opera house and across an underground lake. Now, while we have no evidence of an underground lake beneath the Opera Epiclese, there are some things that suggest this could actually be the case. Firstly, the Fountain of Lucine predates the Opera House, as illustrated in one of the notes found in the Institute for Natural Philosophy. All wishes of the people of Fontaine apparently accumulate here, including the consciousnesses of the people who were dissolved by primordial water. Now, given that Khvarena is the name of the goddess of springs, this fountain may be constructed over a natural spring, drawing from an underground water source. And since the core of the oratrice is also located underground and also draws upon the thoughts of the Fontaine people, the two may be directly connected through an underground channel. I can make this assumption because between Acts 1 and 2 of the Archon Quest, you can actually stand in the fountain and hear Khvarena crying. It could be that we're just hearing her through the water through some elemental attunement shenanigans, but it's equally possible that she's just under the fountain hiding. Now, in The Phantom of the Opera, the female lead Christine made a deal with the Phantom so that he would teach her music. Now, I think this mirrors a deal that Khvarena could have made with Dottore. See, Christine wanted to be an even more skilled vocalist, and Khvarena wanted to make the most perfect judgments. The Phantom granted this wish for Christine, so Dottore could have granted that wish for Khvarena. Now, from what we've seen, Khvarena doesn't have the highest self-esteem and doesn't handle high-pressure situations all that well when she's at a disadvantage. She's mostly play-acting the role of someone who's really confident and proud, but she's really got the heart of a very scared child. She backs down from real fights and tries to bluff her way out of being wrong whenever she can, and what confidence she does seem to have appears to stem from the fact that the oratrice will always make the correct judgment, so Khvarena can effectively absolve herself of a lot of responsibility and thereby a lot of pressure. Water pressure. French jokes. But watch her closely when Child is falsely declared guilty. She doesn't look confused about why this machine that she supposedly created is acting up. She looks shocked and panicked, like she doesn't know what's going on, and I think that's because she didn't build it. Dottore probably did. And not only is the machine very Dottore core, although to be fair, most of Fontaine's steampunk tech is very Dottore core, but I think Dottore might have an even deeper connection to Fontaine and the mysteries therein. Now, this next statement is going to give you massive whiplash, but I think Dottore, like Khvarena, might actually be an Oceanid. And yeah, that's gonna take a lot of explaining, so let's see if I can break this down. As the 4.0 Archon Quest illustrated, Oceanids are a sort of collective consciousness, a being made up of a lot of smaller beings that gain a new collective identity. They also have the potential to separate into smaller beings, something we get to witness firsthand with Anne during the Narzissenkruez Institute World Quest. Now, based on what little we do know, they're supposed to be elemental beings or spirits, but now we have proof that the minds of the people of Fontaine can merge together and form an Oceanid, providing their bodies have been dissolved using the waters from the primordial sea. And the thing is, we've seen liquids that look just like this purplish bluish primordial seawater before, in the form of the sanctifying essence, which is a bottle of distilled ideals and memories that we use to level up artifacts, which are crystallized ideals and memories. By this logic, we can deduce that the primordial waters are also a form of distilled memories. Now, Oceanids function by merging memories and identities together in order to form new ones, and it's very easy for them to become overcome or corrupted by vicious minds, even if they're a little bit weaker than the greater mind. This was explained all the way back in 1.4's Wishful Drops event. So with that in mind, what happens if you dump a whole bottle of liquid memories onto one? Well, they'd probably fall apart. And this is what happens to the people of Fontaine. They lose their identity by being overwhelmed by the concentrated memory juice, and then they fall apart, coming together again in the waters of Fontaine as a new being, an Oceanid. In fact, it is possible that synth, which is a diluted form of the primordial waters, gets people high because it's diluted, so people become overwhelmed momentarily with a pure emotional rush, just not one strong enough for them to forget who they are and fall apart. Now, if you've done any of the world quests, which you should have because of all of my spoiler warnings at the beginning of this video, this is your last chance to back out, you've probably run into some notes and dialogue about a guy named René de Petrichor. He's about to become really, really important. René was a rather special child who was orphaned after the events of the Siege of Poisson. He was taken in by the newly formed Narzissenkruez Institute along with several other children, notably Elaine, Marianne, and Jacob. The institute was an orphanage run by an Oceanid director, presumably named Lyris, and a human military commander, vice director named Basil. An odd combination for sure, but these kids were far from normal. While they were still young and at the institute, the Khvarena cataclysm struck, and the director left with her Oceanid sisters in order to help the Hydro Archon Egeria deal with the disaster. Meanwhile, the vice director Basil left to fight the fell dragon Elenus, who was likely a creation of Rhine daughters, much like Durin. Without their leaders, the institute disbanded and the kids were adopted by some appointed adults. René and Jacob, most notably, were adopted together by an adventurer named Karl, who would take them onto expeditions into Sumeru. Once the cataclysm was over, that is. And it was during one of these expeditions that René realized that his and Jacob's bodies were not like normal human bodies, and instead bore more similarity to that of the sacred lotus found in the Vorukasha oasis. In other words, they were more closely related to the remains of the former Hydro Archon. René proved himself to be a child prodigy at this time, performing complete analyses on the ruined Khvarena technology and azosite energy sources they found before he even lost all his baby teeth. It should be around this time, too, that he began studying abyssal energy as well, claiming that it had higher authority over Teyvat than normal elemental energy, as it could possess a will. So, like a form of sentience. Just for context, this is like an elementary schooler doing crazy particle physics and nuclear fission reaction research. Like, it's at that level. Anyway, during one of these expeditions, Jacob fell ill due to malnutrition, and in order to save him, René attempted to use some kind of abyssal energy through some kind of process we don't know the details of. And this process only succeeded because of his and Jacob's unique non-human constitutions. This would be one of the first early successes of his research. Now, the topic of this research happened to be saving the world from imminent disaster, or at least at the beginning it was saving Fontaine from imminent disaster, because Fontaine had experienced multiple floods in the past, and René thought that there was evidence that more floods were to come, and he wanted to prevent them. Makes sense, right? This led him to discover that the world of Teyvat had been through multiple apocalyptic cycles and that the current cycle is the last one. There would be no new civilizations after this one. This is the prophecy made by his so-called world formula, and it's a conclusion that other civilizations, like Remuria, seem to have discovered as well. René's one goal in life after this was to ensure that humanity survived by any cost. René and Jacob would later establish a secret society named after the orphanage where they first met, the Narzissenkreuz Ordo. Its purpose would be to find a way to thwart the inevitable apocalypse. René concluded through his new research that only evolved humans, or neo-humans, could survive such an apocalypse and began performing experiments with the dragon Elenus, having Jacob consume its flesh as part of those experiments. This is what caused Jacob to gain the body of an abyssling, and I think this is the first instance of this happening to a human that we know of in-game so far. But I want to point out that consecrated beasts were actually just normal humans that then ate the flesh of gods and mutated in a very similar way, so Jacob's condition might not likely be an isolated incident. Renee was unable to repeat this success and ended up killing his friend and research assistant Carter in the process of trying to save him the same way he tried to save Jacob. This made him realize that his neo-human plan wouldn't work, so he came up with a new plan. Instead of making neo-humans, he'd dissolve the people of Fontaine into one liquid mass using the primordial waters. By discarding their physical form, they should be able to survive the apocalypse. Renee and Jacob tested this process on Renee first. Renee declares that he will be reborn through water and that he will return and save the people of Fontaine, which is very fitting for him since his name Renee comes from Renatus, which means to be reborn, and his last name Petrichor is the scent of rain, so he's basically being reborn through water. Anyway, this experiment succeeded, and although the aftermath is a little bit murky, it seems like Renee managed to revive Carter in the process by absorbing his memory from within the primordial waters, thus making Renee an Oceanid-like being that I'm gonna call Renee Carter. Or if you like making puns about historical figures, maybe it's Renee Descartes, like René Descartes, you know, like the French philosopher. You probably know this guy as the I think therefore I am guy, but he was actually a big proponent of the idea that the human body and mind are completely separate things from each other. He argued that the mind could exist without the body, but the body could not exist without the mind. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like a dissolved person casting off their physical shell and existing only as like a ball of liquid memories. Now, I would be remiss in this situation not to mention Renee's possible connection to the infamous philosopher by the name of René Guénon, as Guénon's work seemed to cover basically every important esoteric reference found in Genshin so far, including but not limited to the inverted world tree, hermetic alchemy, and Freemasonry. But most relevant in this case is in his book, The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times, where he talks about the final dissolution, wherein everything and everyone dissolves back into some kind of atomic dust at the end of a cosmic cycle. I am grossly oversimplifying this philosophy again out of necessity because philosophy is egregiously complicated, but even so, Guénon's ideas do seem like a very solid foundation for Hoyo to base Renee's world formula plans on. Now, doesn't it? But honestly, the scope of this guy's work deserves a video by itself, so we'll get to that eventually. So, Renee Carter then figured out that this whole dissolving process allowed for memories and skills of other people to be dissolved and absorbed by him and others in the Ordo, much like how an Oceanid can absorb other Oceanids. They then managed to successfully dissolve and absorb some people and then realize that these people can basically be reduced to a liquid consciousness and then implanted into robot bodies. They needed Elaine's help for all of that, though, because he was the mechanical genius of the lot, and Elaine didn't want to because of reasons that are unimportant for right now. So they went back to Renee's original plan of dissolving all of Fontaine into one gigantic Oceanid, because that's really what the plan is. They're just making one big collective conscious. It's just like the Golden Slumber, you know what I mean? Like, there is a repeating pattern that's showing up here, but I digress. It seems like they never actually succeeded or finished this plan, and instead died in a conflict that took place inside of Elenis, wherein the presumed remains of the Oceanid director Lyris sabotaged the whole thing and dissolved everyone present except for Jacob in the process of her sabotage. Now, Renee Carter swore to return one day to save all of the humans, and Marianne, who you might know as Anne, the little baby Oceanid, well, she turned into the little baby Oceanid. Elaine, however, did survive. I'm not actually sure if he was actually present there or just found out about it later, but he went on to found the Fontaine Research Institute and lose himself in his research on machines and mechanics and energy methods. Now, I know you're all wondering how the hell this actually relates to Dottore, and frankly, I was running entirely on vibes for a while, and then I realized that the connection is actually a little bit obvious, because this whole story just reeks of Evangelion. So spoilers for a 25-year-old series, I guess. But here's the basic context for this show that you need to understand to find out where I'm actually coming from. Basically, some super advanced space aliens created a method of seeding planets with two different types of creatures, which we will just call humans and angels for now. And only one type of creature was supposed to be present on any one planet at any one time, but Earth got unlucky and got both types. So now humans use giant robots to try and prevent angels from causing cataclysms and destroying everything. The worst of these cataclysms were called the first and second impacts, and the goal is ultimately to prevent a third. If you're a longtime Hoyoverse fan, this should sound kind of familiar. And if you've watched my complete Scaramouche analysis, you may remember that I compared him to the main character Shinji. He's severely traumatized, not that mentally or emotionally stable, he's depressed, motherless, and he has a horrible father figure in the form of Gendo, who, basically treats Shinji in the same way that Dottore treats Scaramouche. Shinji was also taken in by a person named Katsuragi, and at some point had to shut down a reactor to save all sorts of people, and his giant Eva robot is also powered with the soul of his mother, and, the Gnosis is the heart of God that powers Shoki no Kami, right? The reason I bring this up is that Dottore is to Scaramouche is what Gendo was to Shinji, a terrible father figure with a ton of power and a shady organization that is trying to save the world from an imminent apocalypse, whose methods are incredibly unethical and very sketchy. Now, Gendo intended to save humanity by melting down the entire human race into a bright orange primordial liquid called LCL, and no one knows what this really stands for, so don't ask me. The point here is that Gendo and Renee happen to have the same goal: return the human to a magic liquid. Gendo's office also contains a lot of Kabbalistic symbolism in it, and Evangelion is, in general, very heavily based on Kabbalic practices, teachings, and symbolism. Very fitting, since Kabbalah's Tree of Life matches Renee's world formula diagram. But I've already likened Gendo to Dottore. And if Gendo is likened to Dottore, but Gendo is also likened to Renee, then Dottore should also be likened to Renee, right? And if we're going on full Eva, then I have to acknowledge that Zandique's notes also make mention of how the desert golems lacked gyroscopes, and they would therefore have needed humans to make modifications to their vestibular systems or be bound to the machine in order to pilot it. And that sounds a lot like an Eva plug suit, which Scaramouche later references while inside the Shoki no Kami. And that was when I realized that Dottore might be both Zandique and Renee. Remember how I mentioned that the Narzissenkreuz Ordo realized they could dissolve people, absorb them, and then distill them back into liquefied individual consciousnesses that could pilot robot bodies? That sounds a lot like Dottore, and also Evangelion. This guy created robotic segments that he based on decades of research on Scaramouche's mechanical body. He then claims these are his perspectives from different stages of his life and that he made all of them independent individuals, and every single one of them has a vial of this blue liquid present. This sounds suspiciously like the Ordo's attempt at making liquid human robots. And Renee Carter realized that he could absorb the memories and skills of other people, right? So it's very possible that Dottore could do this as well. Imagine Zandique scouring books and old research labs, stumbling upon Renee Carter's research and then using himself as a test subject. Imagine if he recreated their oceanidification and then managed to find the consciousnesses of Renee Carter in the primordial water and then absorbed them into himself. I mean, these guys have so much in common with the way that they think and their goals that they'd probably be quite compatible, right? And it would directly reference how Maitre built upon the work of Descartes. Because he kind of did. Maitre believed that a human functioned a lot like a machine, and he often referenced Descartes' idea of body-mind separatism, and how the mind could exist separate from the body, but the body could not exist separate from the mind. This is basically Zandique building on the research of Renee Carter. In that situation, Dottore's segments from different points in his life could span multiple lifetimes and multiple people, since he'd be this completely new identity altogether. Being an Oceanid of sorts means that he could be one person while still being many individuals. Plus, Dottore is Oceanid colored, and all human-shaped Oceanids are blue. And the masks that he wears could be hiding some kind of robotic features or deformities, kind of like Phantom of the Opera style, because the Phantom actually wore a mask in order to hide his physical deformities. And it would also explain why the manga version of the Doctor has a mask that doesn't have any nose holes in it. Because, like, if he's a robot, he doesn't really need to breathe, you know? But all of these little details fit together so nicely that it's so implausible for me to think that they're coincidental. And And I'm sure there may even be more references that we're just not aware of yet because Dottore hasn't had a ton of on-screen time. If I'm right about these connections between Zandique and Renee Carter, then technically Dottore should have the ability to absorb as many minds as he wants to. So like, after deleting his segments as per Nahida's request, he didn't seem all that fussed, right? He claimed he would just simply find some new perspectives. So maybe he makes a habit of going around dissolving and absorbing other scientists and people with interesting knowledge. So long as his mind is the dominant one, he would reap infinite benefits from this, and it would make him disgustingly powerful. I think that all of this will actually lead into some events in the Archon Quest regarding the Oratrice. And if it happens to be this robotic machine with a liquid-based consciousness of its own, well, that's not too far off from what Dottore is now, is it? Let's just say I think his involvement is pretty clear. And thus concludes the end of this Dottore theory that nobody saw coming, not even me. I had a whole nother section here too about how this all connects to Arlecchino, but I'm actually going to put that in the Archon Quest analysis video instead because I think it fits better there. I will leave a link in the description for that if you're interested in figuring out how this all connects together. But while the credits roll with all the names of my very, very patient channel members, I have 2 fun facts to share with you, or 2 fun observations, take your pick. So because Evangelion's LCL is orange, a lot of fans call it Tang or Fanta, and Fontaine has this stupid drink called Fanta because Fanta was apparently invented in France, and with all of this talk about people melting into a sentient liquid, I don't think I've ever been so mad about a pun in my entire life. Also, the prophecy of Renee's world formula shows a sky that's shattered like it was glass, and this is very similar to the sky from Fischl's Golden Apple Archipelago event, suggesting that Fischl's story, not Amy's, but like actual real Fischl, might actually tell the story of a previous apocalypse that happened. But it is worth pointing out that it was Dottore who told Nahida that the sky is a lie. Previously, this was knowledge only Scaramouche, Piero, Barbelloth, and to a lesser degree Mona were aware of. And it makes sense that the number 2 Harbinger knows this as well, but it is interesting to see it line up with Renee's prophecy if Dottore is at all connected to Renee himself. So anyway, guys, that's it for me for today, so I hope you're all enjoying Fontaine. I obviously am having a ball here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back very soon with even more wild lore and theory findings because this lore of Fontaine is kinda nuts. So take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you all in the next video.